The air in the grand ballroom of the Azure Heights Hotel did not just smell of expensive lilies and aged bourbon, it smelled of power, cold and unyielding. Victor Sloane stood at the center of a circle of men whose suits cost more than a common laborer's annual salary. He swirled a glass of crystal-clear gin, his eyes tracking a figure moving quietly along the periphery of the room. Zafira. To the investors, she was a blur of black and white fabric, a shadow that emptied crystal ashtrays and smoothed invisible creases in the silk tablecloths. To Victor, she was the perfect lead for the performance he had spent the morning perfecting. He leaned in closer to a silver-haired executive, a conspiratorial glint in his eyes that signaled a brewing storm. "You know," Victor murmured, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone, "luxury is often wasted on those who cannot comprehend it. We have a girl here, a ghost, really, who thinks she is part of the architecture." He gestured toward Zafira, who was currently kneeling to retrieve a fallen napkin. She did not look up, but the line of her shoulders was rigid, a silent fortress against the laughter she knew was coming. "I've prepared a little surprise for the evening's climax," Victor continued, his smile sharpening like a blade. "A test of sorts. A way to remind our quietest staff member exactly where the dirt ends and the marble begins. It is a bit of a dirty joke, really, but I think you'll find the punchline quite enlightening." The men around him chuckled, the sound dry and brittle. They did not see the woman who heard the tremor in their voices or the secrets they whispered when they thought the furniture was deaf. Victor adjusted his silk tie, feeling the rush of adrenaline that came with a successful ambush. He had orchestrated every detail, from the specific, degrading task she would be forced to perform to the exact moment the spotlight would catch the soot he intended to smear across her dignity. Zafira remained a statue in the shadows, her fingers tightening around the damp cloth in her hand. She felt the weight of Victor's gaze like a physical brand on her neck. He thought he was the hunter, and she the prey, waiting for a punchline that would end her. What he did not realize was that some jokes do not just fail, they ignite. The morning mist still clung to the glass spires of the Azure Heights Hotel when Zafira began her rounds. To the world that paid for the penthouse views, she was a non-entity, a soft-stepping shadow in a stiffly starched uniform that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. At 5 a.m., the lobby was a cathedral of echoing silence and cold marble, and Zafira was its silent acolyte. She moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, her cleaning cart a mobile fortress of chemical sprays and microfiber cloths. In the high-stakes world of the Azure Heights, people didn't just have wealth, they had secrets that weighed more than the gold leaf on the ceiling. Because she was treated like a piece of the architecture, Zafira had become the keeper of those weights. She was the Azure Ghost, the woman who saw the cracks in the porcelain masks long before they shattered. Her day was measured in the hushed conversations that occurred over her bowed head. While she polished the brass railings of the mezzanine, she listened to the frantic whispers of an executive whose foolproof merger was actually a house of cards waiting for the wind. As she emptied the heavy crystal ashtrays in the private smoking lounge, she heard the jagged breathing of a man who had just traded his family's legacy for a moment of silence from a blackmailer. They spoke freely because they believed the furniture was deaf. To them, Zafira was a tool, an appliance designed to erase the evidence of their existence. She knew which senator preferred his bourbon with a side of regret at 3 a.m. She knew which socialite cried in the service elevator because her designer life felt like a cage. Most importantly, she knew the rhythm of Victor Sloane's footsteps, the sharp, arrogant click of his heels that signaled a new round of petty cruelties. Victor treated the hotel like a stage and the staff like props. He would often stop her in the middle of a hallway, pointing out a microscopic smudge on a mirror with the tip of his silver-headed cane. "You see this, Zafira?" he would purr, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness. "It's a blemish. And in my hotel, we do not tolerate blemishes. Not on the glass, and certainly not on the staff." Zafira would lower her head further, her eyes tracing the intricate patterns in the carpet. She never argued. She never looked him in the eye. She kept her back a straight, dignified line, a hidden fortress of pride that Victor could never quite breach. She let him believe he had broken her spirit because a broken spirit was invisible, and invisibility was her greatest weapon. Deep in the bowels of the hotel, in a locker room that smelled of industrial detergent and old coffee, Zafira kept a small, tattered notebook. In it, she didn't record her chores or her hours. She recorded the things the elite thought they had buried. She knew the codes to the private safes, she knew the names of the guests who never checked in at the front desk. She was waiting, her quiet strength a coiled spring, for the moment that Azure Ghost would finally decide to speak. As the sun rose higher, casting long, golden fingers across the lobby, the hotel began to roar with the sound of the powerful. The cars glided to the curb, and the diamonds caught the light. Zafira pushed her cart back into the shadows of a side corridor, her presence fading as the theater of the wealthy began. She was a ghost in their house, a silent witness to their slow-motion decay, and she knew a truth that Victor Sloane would never understand: the people who clean the floors are the only ones who truly know how much filth is hidden beneath the gold. The gold-leafed doors of the executive office suite slid open with a whisper of well-oiled precision, admitting Zafira into a realm of mahogany and filtered sunlight. Victor Sloane was silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline spread out behind him like a kingdom he believed he ruled. He did not turn immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, a calculated wait designed to make the girl in the charcoal uniform feel the crushing scale of the room. "You know, Zafira," Victor began, his voice a smooth, terrifying silk as he finally turned, "the Azure Heights is built on a very specific type of perfection. It is an illusion that requires total devotion. Every thread must be in place. Every shadow must know its boundaries." Zafira stood by the door, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She did not fidget. She did not look at the expensive art on the walls. She kept her gaze fixed on a point exactly 3 inches below Victor's silk tie. To look him in the eye was to invite a different kind of malice, one she wasn't yet ready to trigger. Victor stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the hardwood. He stopped just inches away, the scent of his sandalwood cologne clashing with the faint, honest smell of lemon oil that followed Zafira everywhere. He reached out with his silver-tipped cane, using the cold metal to lift her chin. "I've noticed a certain stiffness in you lately," he purred, his eyes narrowing as he searched her face for a crack in the porcelain. "A posture that doesn't quite match the dirt on your sleeves. It's almost as if you've forgotten that you are here to serve, not to observe. You are a maid, Zafira. A girl from nowhere with nothing but the air in her lungs and the rag in her hand. Do you understand your value?" "I am here to work, Mr. Sloane," she replied, her voice low and steady, a calm river beneath a frozen surface. Victor laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Work? No, you are here to be invisible. But for the Investors Gala tonight, I require something more. I've decided that our guests need a reminder of what true service looks like. A bit of theater to highlight the contrast between their world and yours." He withdrew the cane, but the cold sensation lingered on her skin. He walked back to his desk, picking up a heavy, gold-embossed card. "There will be a demonstration in the main lobby tonight. A VIP mess that requires a singular touch. You will clean it, Zafira. Not with your carts or your mops, but on your knees, with your bare hands, in front of the very men who decide the fate of this city. You will show them the absolute submission that makes the Azure Heights what it is." The air in the room seemed to thin. Zafira felt the hidden weight of the locket beneath her uniform, a reminder of a life where submission was a word used for enemies, not for her. The thought of the public humiliation, that a social ambush Victor had spent days perfecting, sent a flicker of heat through her veins, but she kept her expression as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. "And if I refuse?" she asked, the question barely a whisper. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes, it stopped at his teeth. Then you are more than a blemish, Zafira. You are a cancer. And cancers are excised. If you do not perform exactly as I've laid out tonight, you will not only lose this job, you will be blacklisted from every luxury estate from here to the coast. I will see to it that you are so invisible that even the shadows won't claim you. You'll be back in the gutters where I suspect you were found, with nothing but your straight back to keep you warm. He leaned over his desk, his face a mask of predatory delight. Don't mistake my patience for weakness. You are part of the furniture until I decide you are trash. Tonight, you will be the entertainment. You will play the part of the broken girl, or you will be truly broken. Do we have an understanding? Zafira lowered her head, the golden braids of her hair catching the light like a hidden crown. I understand, Mr. Sloane. Good, Victor snapped, dismissing her with a flick of his wrist. Be in the lobby by the second bell. And Zafira? Don't bother washing the soot off your face. It adds to the authenticity. As Zafira exited the office, the heavy doors closing behind her, she didn't collapse. She didn't tremble. She walked back toward the service elevator, her spine a line of unbreakable steel. Victor Sloane thought he was handing her a death sentence of shame. He had no idea that he was merely setting the stage for a reckoning he could never survive. The trap was set, but as Zafira felt the steady beat of her own heart, she knew that tonight, the joke would not be on her. The basement levels of the Azure Heights Hotel were a labyrinth of humming pipes and sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors that smelled of industrial bleach and unwashed exhaustion. Here, the gold leaf and crystal of the upper floors were a distant myth. Zafira sat on the edge of a narrow wooden bench in the staff locker room, the sound of the distant laundry chutes providing a hollow, rhythmic thud that echoed the drumming in her chest. She reached into the back of her locker, past the spare gray tunic and the small, worn book of poetry she read to keep her mind sharp. Hidden beneath the false bottom of a tattered jewelry box was a small pouch of heavy, midnight blue silk. Her fingers trembled slightly as she untied the cord. Out slid a heavy obsidian coin, edged in brushed gold. In its center, a singular emblem was embossed, the sharp, predatory profile of a dragon, its eyes formed by two microscopic rubies that seemed to catch the dim light of the locker room and burn with a life of their own. It was a token of absolute protection, a silent promise from Li Taehwan. She remembered the night he had pressed it into her hand. It had been 3 years ago, in a rain-slicked alleyway far from the gilded cages of the city's elite. He had looked at her not as a stray to be pitied, but as a sovereign in exile. You are a queen among beggars, Zafira, he had whispered, his voice a low vibration of steel and silk. When the world tries to bury you, show them the dragon. One word, and I will burn their houses to the ground to keep you warm. Zafira closed her eyes, the cold stone of the coin pressing against her palm. For 3 years, she had refused to use it. She had chosen the shadows. She had chosen to be the Azure Ghost because she wanted to prove that she could survive the filth of the world without the blood-stained shield of the Mafia. She had wanted her dignity to be her own, forged in the labor of her hands and the silence of her tongue. But Victor Sloane had changed the rules. Tonight's gala was not just about work, it was a social execution. Victor wanted to strip away the last of her pride, to turn her into a spectacle of submissiveness for the amusement of men who bought and sold lives over cocktails. He had threatened to blacklist her, to ensure she was so invisible that she would starve in the very streets she had worked so hard to rise above. She looked at the obsidian coin, the rubies shimmering like drops of blood. To call Li Taehwan was to end the life she had built. It was to admit that the shadows could no longer protect her. It meant stepping back into a world of power and peril, where her name would once again carry the weight of a crown. It meant Li would arrive not just as a savior, but as a claimant. He would claim his queen, and the Azure Heights, along with Victor Sloane, would realize too late that they had been trampling on a goddess. Her thumb traced the dragon's scales. The temptation was a physical ache. She could walk to the payphone in the hallway, dial the number she had memorized but never touched, and by the second bell of the gala, the lobby would be filled with black suits and the terrifying silence of the underworld. Victor Sloane's arrogance would turn to ash before the first course was served. Yet, a stubborn, fierce pride flickered in her gut. If she called him now, before the trap was even sprung, she was still running. Zafira stood up, her spine snapping into that familiar, unbreakable line. She didn't put the coin back into the locker. Instead, she slid it into a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her uniform, right against her ribs. She would not call him yet. She would walk into the lobby, she would face the mockery, and she would let Victor Sloane believe his dirty joke was a success. She would wait until the very moment he thought he had won. She would wait until the eyes of the city were fixed on her submission. And then, she would decide if it was time for the ghost to vanish and the queen to rise. As she adjusted her collar and smeared a calculated smudge of soot across her cheekbone, Zafira felt a cold, calm clarity. The token was no longer just a memento, it was a detonator. Tonight, the Azure Heights would learn that some shadows have teeth. The Azure Heights was no longer a hotel, it had become a cathedral of excess. Outside, a line of expensive cars hissed to a halt, their tires crunching over the frost-dusted gravel. Inside, the lobby was a blur of midnight silks and shimmering silver, a sea of diamonds that caught the light of the chandeliers and threw it back with a cold, jagged brilliance. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the sharp, metallic tang of money, the kind of wealth that didn't just buy things, but redefined reality for everyone in its path. Zafira stood in the deep shadows of a mahogany pillar, watching the elite gather. They moved with a predatory grace, their laughter brittle and loud, their eyes constantly scanning for the next advantage. To them, the hotel staff were merely ghosts in the periphery, silent hands that offered trays of champagne and swept away the debris of their indulgence. But tonight, Zafira was not allowed to be a ghost. She looked down at her hands. Victor had been thorough. Her uniform, once a crisp gray, was now marred by calculated streaks of soot and damp grime. He had insisted she not wash the dust of the basement from her sleeves, wanting the authenticity of the gutter to be visible against the marble. The smudge on her cheekbone felt like a brand, a physical mark of the shame he intended to heap upon her. Against her ribs, the obsidian coin felt like a hot coal, its weight a silent, heavy promise. The second bell of the gala rang, a clear, resonant tone that vibrated through the floorboards. "Ah, there she is," Victor Sloane's voice cut through the hum of the crowd. He stood at the center of the grand lobby, surrounded by the city's most influential investors. He looked every inch the triumphant king, his silk tie shimmering under the lights, his silver-headed cane planted firmly on the floor. He gestured toward Zafira with a slow, sweeping movement that forced every eye in the room to pivot toward her. "Come forward, Zafira. Don't be shy. Our guests have been hearing so much about the singular dedication of our staff." The walk from the pillar to the center of the lobby felt like a march to the scaffold. As Zafira stepped into the light, a ripple of quiet, cruel laughter moved through the assembly. The contrast was visceral. In a room filled with women in gowns that cost a fortune, she was a blemish, a ragged stain on the perfection of the Azure Heights. She could see the sneers, the way the socialites pulled their silk skirts away as she passed, as if poverty were a contagion that could be caught by a passing touch. She stopped 5 feet from Victor, her head bowed in the practiced posture of a servant. She could feel the heat of the spotlights on the back of her neck and the cold, analytical gaze of 100 strangers. "Gentlemen," Victor said, his voice dripping with a condescending honey, "I promised you a demonstration of true hotel standards. A glimpse into the machinery that keeps this palace running. Sometimes, the marble requires more than just a brush. It requires a certain humility. He reached into his pocket and produced a heavy, crystal glass filled with a dark, oily liquid, a mixture of dregs and soot he had prepared specifically for this moment. With a slow, deliberate tilt of his hand, he poured the contents onto the pristine white marble between his boots. The liquid splattered, a dark, ugly wound on the stone. "A VIP mess," Victor purred, his eyes locked onto Zafira's bowed head. "And as I told you earlier, Zafira, this is not a task for tools. This requires the human touch. On your knees. Show them how we handle the filth at the Azure Heights." The lobby went silent. It was a suffocating, expectant quiet, broken only by the distant, rhythmic ticking of the grand clock. Zafira didn't move for a long second. She felt the coin against her ribs, the dragon's ruby eyes burning into her skin. She saw Victor's smile, a sharp, jagged thing that signaled his total belief in his victory. He thought he was breaking her. He thought he was proving that she was nothing more than the dirt she was meant to clean. Slowly, Zafira began to sink toward the floor. Her knees touched the cold, unyielding stone. She reached out toward the dark stain, her fingers hovering just above the oily liquid. The laughter around her grew louder, a sharp, collective bark of derision that filled the vaulted space. Victor leaned over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "That's it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crowd. "Stay there, in the dirt where you belong. Let them see you." But as Zafira's fingers finally touched the marble, she didn't feel the weight of shame. She felt a cold, crystalline clarity. She looked at her reflection in the polished stone, distorted by the soot on her face, but with eyes that remained unyielding. She wasn't a maid in the dirt. She was a queen waiting for the first sound of the storm. And then, from the main entrance, the heavy oak doors didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a force that made the crystal chandeliers above them shiver. The laughter in the room died as if it had been cut by a blade. The sound of power had arrived. The dark, oily liquid spread across the white marble like an inkblot on a fresh shroud, thick and smelling of iron and industrial waste. Zafira remained on her knees, the coldness of the stone seeping through the fabric of her uniform and into her skin. The laughter that had rippled through the lobby now settled into a low, buzzing hum of collective amusement. To the men in their custom-tailored tuxedos and the women draped in liquid gold, this wasn't an act of cruelty, it was a curated experience, a piece of performance art that validated their own elevation. Victor Sloane stood over her, his polished shoes inches from her fingertips. He looked down, not with a flare of anger, but with a terrifying, clinical detachment. He adjusted his silver cufflinks, the metal glinting under the glare of the chandeliers. "You see, gentlemen," Victor said, his voice projecting to the furthest corners of the vaulted ceiling, "the true secret to a five-star experience isn't the thread count of the sheets or the vintage of the wine. It is the absolute, unquestioning erasure of the self. A great hotel is built on the backs of those who understand that their only purpose is to absorb the world's filth so that you never have to see it." He stepped closer, the tip of his silver-headed cane coming to rest just beside Zafira's hand. "Look at her," he invited, his tone dripping with mock reverence. "The Azure Ghost. She has been with us for 3 years, and in all that time, she has never once spoken out of turn. She has never once looked a guest in the eye. She is the perfect servant because she is perfectly aware of her own insignificance." Zafira's fingers curled slightly against the marble, the dark liquid staining her nails. She didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on the reflection of a crystal chandelier in the oily puddle, its light distorted and broken by the grime. Every muscle in her back was a coiled spring, a line of tension so tight it threatened to snap. Against her ribs, the obsidian coin felt like a pulse, a heavy, secret heartbeat that whispered of a different world. A silver-haired investor, a man whose name Zafira knew from the hushed secrets of the smoking lounge, stepped forward. He peered down at her through gold-rimmed glasses, his expression one of mild curiosity, as if he were inspecting a curious insect. "Extraordinary," the man murmured. "The discipline is commendable, Sloane. But tell me, does she truly understand the gravity of her station, or is she merely a well-trained animal?" Victor's smile widened, a sharp, jagged thing. "That is the beauty of it, Arthur. At this level of service, there is no difference." Zafira apologized to the guests for the unsightly blemish on their evening. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was a vacuum, a space where Zafira's dignity was meant to be swallowed whole. She felt the weight of 100 gazes, 100 expectations of her breaking. She knew what Victor wanted. He wanted her to weep. He wanted her to beg for her job, to grovel in the soot he had smeared across her face. Instead, Zafira stood. She did not rush. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that made the laughter in the room falter. She rose from the floor, her spine clicking into that familiar, unbreakable line of steel. She did not wipe the soot from her cheek, nor did she hide her stained hands. She stood before the assembly of the city's most powerful people, and for the first time in 3 years, she raised her head. She didn't look at the investors. She looked directly at Victor Sloane. Her gaze was not one of anger. It was a cold, crystalline clarity that seemed to strip away the silk and the mahogany of the room. She stood in her ruined uniform, surrounded by diamonds, and yet she was the only person in the lobby who looked truly solid. The soot on her face didn't look like dirt anymore, it looked like war paint. Victor's smile wavered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing. He saw the shift. He saw that the social ambush he had spent days perfecting had failed to produce the victim he required. She was standing in the center of his trap, and she looked like she was the one in control. "I have cleaned your floors, Mr. Sloane," Zafira said, her voice low and resonant, carrying through the stillness like a tolling bell. "I have heard your secrets. I have carried the weight of this hotel in my silence. But I am not part of the furniture. And I am certainly not your joke." Victor's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. The embarrassment he had intended for her was suddenly reflecting back onto him, a mirror he hadn't prepared for. "How dare you," he hissed, his voice trembling with a lethal edge. "Get back on your knees. You are nothing. You are a maid I plucked from the gutter, and I can send you back there before the next bell rings." He raised his silver-headed cane, the gesture instinctive and violent. The guests drew back, the air suddenly charged with the scent of an impending explosion. Zafira didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the obsidian coin. She didn't need to call him. She knew that the sound of power she had heard at the door wasn't just a coincidence. The storm hadn't just arrived. It was already inside. The heavy, gold-leafed oak doors of the main entrance didn't just open, they were an eruption. They gave way with a sound like a thunderclap, a violent rejection of the lobby's forced elegance that reverberated through the marble floor. The sound traveled up the soles of Zafira's boots and vibrated in the very center of Victor's chest, a physical shockwave that silenced the room before the intruder had even taken a step. The humid, expensive air of the gala was suddenly pierced by a draft that tasted of ozone and rain, the scent of a storm that had finally breached the high walls of the Azure Heights. He didn't walk in, he took possession of the space. Lee Taehwan crossed the threshold with a deliberate, rhythmic stride that made the frantic social posturing of the room seem like a child's game. He was tall, clad in a suit of such deep charcoal it seemed to drink the light of the chandeliers rather than reflect it. His presence was a gravitational pull, an absolute authority that demanded the world stop and acknowledge his arrival. Behind him, 3 men moved in perfect, lethal synchronization. They were dressed in the same dark suits, their faces masks of unyielding stone, their eyes scanning the room with a cold, predatory efficiency that made the hotel's own security detail look like frightened boys. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A waiter, halfway through pouring a glass of vintage champagne for an investor, froze in place, the liquid splashing unheeded onto the silver tray and soaking his white gloves. The string quartet in the mezzanine sputtered to a discordant halt, the music dying in their throats as the bows hovered motionless over the strings. Even the investors, men who prided themselves on being unshakable masters of the city, felt their voices wither. The laughter that had been the soundtrack of Zafira's humiliation was replaced by a heavy, airless stillness. It was the silence of a forest when the apex predator enters the clearing, a primal recognition of a power that operated outside the polite rules of silk and mahogany. Lee did not look at the priceless art on the walls. He did not look at the terrified socialites clutching their pearls or the men who suddenly found the floor very interesting. He did not even look at the self-proclaimed king of the Azure Heights, Victor Sloane, whose silver-headed cane was still raised in a trembling, forgotten threat. Lee's focus was a singular, laser-bright beam fixed on the woman standing in the center of the lobby, the woman in the soot-stained uniform with the straight back and the eyes of a fallen sovereign. As he approached, the crowd parted like a sea before a blade. The rhythmic click of his boots on the marble was the only sound in the vaulted space, a steady countdown to a reckoning. Victor stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged expression of incomprehension. He had spent his evening orchestrating a social ambush to validate his own cruelty, but he had not prepared for the underworld to arrive and judge it. Zafira felt the obsidian coin in her pocket settle against her thigh. Its rubies were no longer burning with a frantic heat, instead, they felt cool, possessing a steady, dark glow that matched the calm in her own heart. She didn't move as Lee reached her. She stood her ground, her fingers loosening their grip on the hidden token. She didn't need the detonator anymore, the explosion was standing right in front of her, dressed in charcoal silk. Lee stopped a mere foot away. He ignored Victor entirely, treating the manager as if he were less than the dirt Zafira had been ordered to clean. He looked at the smudge of soot on her cheek, the dark stains on her hands, and the unyielding fire in her blue eyes. A shadow of something dark and ancient crossed his face, not the loud anger of a common man, but a lethal, quiet promise of retribution. "Zafira," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried to the furthest corners of the room, a low vibration of steel and silk that redefined the very atmosphere of the hotel. The dragon does not stay in the shadows forever. He reached out, his hand, calloused from the hilt of a blade but possessing a terrifying, regal grace, hovering for a heartbeat before coming to rest on her shoulder. It was not a gesture of comfort for a victim, it was a claim. It was the sound of power, and as Zafira felt the weight of his hand, she knew the Azure Ghost had finally vanished. The Queen had been found, and the Azure Heights was about to realize exactly whose blood they had tried to spill. The heavy, gold-leafed oak doors of the main entrance didn't just open, they were an eruption. They gave way with a sound like a thunderclap, a violent rejection of the lobby's forced elegance that reverberated through the marble floor. The sound traveled up the soles of Zafira's boots and vibrated in the very center of Victor's chest, a physical shockwave that silenced the room before the intruder had even taken a step. The humid, expensive air of the gala was suddenly pierced by a draft that tasted of ozone and rain, the scent of a storm that had finally breached the high walls of the Azure Heights. He didn't walk in, he took possession of the space. Lee Taehwan crossed the threshold with a deliberate, rhythmic stride that made the frantic social posturing of the room seem like a child's game. He was tall, clad in a suit of such deep charcoal it seemed to drink the light of the chandeliers rather than reflect it. His presence was a gravitational pull, an absolute authority that demanded the world stop and acknowledge his arrival. Behind him, 3 men moved in perfect, lethal synchronization. They were dressed in the same dark suits, their faces masks of unyielding stone, their eyes scanning the room with a cold, predatory efficiency that made the hotel's own security detail look like frightened boys. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A waiter, halfway through pouring a glass of vintage champagne for an investor, froze in place, the liquid splashing unheeded onto the silver tray and soaking his white gloves. The string quartet in the mezzanine sputtered to a discordant halt, the music dying in their throats as the bows hovered motionless over the strings. Even the investors, men who prided themselves on being unshakable masters of the city, felt their voices wither. The laughter that had been the soundtrack of Zafira's humiliation was replaced by a heavy, airless stillness. It was the silence of a forest when the apex predator enters the clearing, a primal recognition of a power that operated outside the polite rules of silk and mahogany. Lee did not look at the priceless art on the walls. He did not look at the terrified socialites clutching their pearls or the men who suddenly found the floor very interesting. He did not even look at the self-proclaimed king of the Azure Heights, Victor Sloane, whose silver-headed cane was still raised in a trembling, forgotten threat. Lee's focus was a singular, laser-bright beam fixed on the woman standing in the center of the lobby, the woman in the soot-stained uniform with the straight back and the eyes of a fallen sovereign. As he approached, the crowd parted like a sea before a blade. The rhythmic click of his boots on the marble was the only sound in the vaulted space, a steady countdown to a reckoning. Victor stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged expression of incomprehension. He had spent his evening orchestrating a social ambush to validate his own cruelty, but he had not prepared for the underworld to arrive and judge it. Zafira felt the obsidian coin in her pocket settle against her thigh. Its rubies were no longer burning with a frantic heat, instead, they felt cool, possessing a steady, dark glow that matched the calm in her own heart. She didn't move as Lee reached her. She stood her ground, her fingers loosening their grip on the hidden token. She didn't need the detonator anymore, the explosion was standing right in front of her, dressed in charcoal silk. Lee stopped a mere foot away. He ignored Victor entirely, treating the manager as if he were less than the dirt Zafira had been ordered to clean. He looked at the smudge of soot on her cheek, the dark stains on her hands, and the unyielding fire in her blue eyes. A shadow of something dark and ancient crossed his face, not the loud anger of a common man, but a lethal, quiet promise of retribution. "Zafira," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried to the furthest corners of the room, a low vibration of steel and silk that redefined the very atmosphere of the hotel. The dragon does not stay in the shadows forever. He reached out, his hand, calloused from the hilt of a blade but possessing a terrifying, regal grace, hovering for a heartbeat before coming to rest on her shoulder. It was not a gesture of comfort for a victim, it was a claim. It was the sound of power, and as Zafira felt the weight of his hand, she knew the Azure Ghost had finally vanished. The Queen had been found, and the Azure Heights was about to realize exactly whose blood they had tried to spill. The silence in the lobby of the Azure Heights was no longer the heavy, expectant quiet of a theater, it had become a sharp, airless vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Victor Sloane stood paralyzed, his silver-headed cane held aloft like a forgotten weapon in a war he had already lost. His eyes were fixed on Lee Taehwan, and for the first time in his life, the manager looked truly small. Lee didn't rush. He didn't need to. He moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who owned the very ground beneath his boots. As he walked toward the center of the lobby, he did not look at the investors or the socialites. He ignored the men whose names filled the financial papers and the women whose jewels could have bought a kingdom. To him, they were nothing but ghosts, echoes of a social order that ended at the threshold of his presence. He walked past them with a terrifying indifference, his charcoal suit cutting a dark, jagged path through the sea of silk and diamonds. The three guards followed him in a silent, predatory formation, their gazes sweeping the crowd like searchlights. Every guest who caught their eyes immediately looked away, a primal instinct for survival overriding their pampered egos. The elite, who moments ago had been laughing at the soot on Zafira's face, now shrank back, their champagne flutes trembling in their hands. Lee reached the edge of the dark, oily stain on the floor. He didn't avoid it. He stepped right to its edge, his shadow falling over Zafira like a heavy, protective shroud. He stood by her side, his body a wall between her and the prying, judgmental eyes of the court. "And Mr. Lee," Victor stammered, his voice cracking like dry wood. He lowered his cane, his hand shaking so violently the silver tip rattled against the marble. We didn't know you were expected. This is a private event. A standard disciplinary matter with the staff." Lee didn't even glance at him. He turned his focus entirely to Zafira. The lethal hardness in his eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted, turning into a searing, reverent intensity. He reached out, his hand, scarred by the life he led but possessing a terrifying, regal grace, hovering for a heartbeat before coming to rest firmly on Zafira's shoulder. The contact was a thunderclap in the stillness. It wasn't a gesture of comfort for a victim, it was an act of absolute, public reclamation. It was a signal of protection so profound that the air in the lobby seemed to charge with static. By touching her, he wasn't just shielding a maid, he was declaring a sovereign. "Stand up, Zafira," Lee said. His voice was a low, melodic vibration that carried to the furthest corners of the vaulted ceiling. It was not a request, it was an invitation back into the world of the living. Zafira did not hesitate. She rose from her knees, her movement fluid and graceful. She didn't look at the dirt on her hands or the grime on her uniform. She kept her head high, her spine a line of unbreakable steel that seemed to grow taller under the weight of Lee's hand. She stood her ground, the Azure Ghost finally solidifying into the queen she was always meant to be. Lee finally turned his gaze to Victor. It was a slow, predatory movement that made the manager's knees buckle. "You spoke of standards, Victor," Lee murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate level. "You spoke of value. But you are a man who looks at a diamond and sees only the coal. You look at a queen and see only the straw." He tightened his grip on Zafira's shoulder, pulling her slightly closer, a silent claim of ownership that made the crowd gasp. The investors who had mocked her now looked as though they wanted to melt into the stone. They realized that they hadn't just witnessed a maid being bullied, they had witnessed a mafia boss's queen being insulted. And in Lee Tae-hwan's world, insults were paid for in blood and ruin. "The Azure Heights has been a house of shadows for too long," Lee continued, his eyes scanning the room, pinning every guest to the spot. "But shadows have a way of catching fire." He turned Zafira away from the stain and the stuttering manager. He began to lead her toward the doors, his guards stepping into place to clear a wide, reverent path through the crowd. The elite moved aside with a frantic, desperate speed, their silks hissing against the floor as they scrambled to get out of the way. Zafira walked with him, her boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel as they reached the entrance. She didn't look back at the hotel or the life she was leaving behind. She felt the heavy, obsidian coin in her pocket, and for the first time in 3 years, the dragon wasn't a secret. It was her shield. As they stepped into the night air, the doors of the Azure Heights swung shut behind them, the sound final and hollow. The lost queen had been found, and the city was about to learn that when a ghost decides to come home, she brings the storm with her. Victor Sloane's hand, still white-knuckled around a silver-headed cane, began to tremble with a rhythmic, metallic clicking against the marble floor. The sound, once a cadence of his own arrogance, now felt like a frantic heartbeat echoing in the suffocating silence of the lobby. The air, which had been thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the cruel delight of his guests, was suddenly stripped of its warmth, replaced by a cold, jagged tension that radiated from Lee Tae-hwan. Victor's eyes, wide and glassed with a dawning, visceral terror, darted from the soot-stained hem of Zafira's uniform to the protective, possessive grip of the man standing beside her. He had spent years treating Zafira as a non-entity, a silent shadow that existed only to absorb the world's filth. He had believed she was nothing more than a ghost he had plucked from the gutters, someone whose very existence was a blemish he could erase at will. But as Li Taehuan looked at him, Victor realized that he had not been bullying a maid, he had been attempting to break a sovereign. Li's gaze was not merely angry, it was lethal, a dark, fathomless ocean of intent that promised ruin to anything it touched. "You seem confused, Victor," Li murmured, his voice a low vibration that made the crystal chandeliers above them shiver. One of Li's guards stepped forward, his face an unyielding mask of stone. He didn't speak, but he held out a singular, dark dossier. The crest on the cover, the same dragon that marked the obsidian coin now heavy in Zafira's pocket, seemed to burn under the lobby lights. The realization hit Victor like a physical blow to the chest, turning his blood to ice. Zafira Elan Noir. The name he had spent the evening dragging through the soot was the same name that had once defined the city's most prestigious charitable legacies. He remembered the whispered stories of the Elan Noir family, the university scholars, the founders of the great community programs, the royals of a world he had only ever seen from the outside. They hadn't vanished into ash, they had merely moved into the shadows. Victor's stiff posture shattered as his knees finally betrayed him, buckling under the weight of his own miscalculation. He looked toward the investors, the men he had tried to impress with his dirty joke, but they were already retreating into the darkness of the mezzanine, their faces pale with a sudden, desperate need to be forgotten. They saw what Victor was only now beginning to comprehend. He had tried to humiliate a woman whose lineage was older and deeper than the very foundations of the Azure Heights. It was just a joke, Victor stammered, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched scrape that sounded like dry leaves in a storm. "A harmless joke, Mr. Li. For the investors. To show the standards of the hotel." Li's hand tightened on Zafira's shoulder, a silent, absolute claim that seemed to draw all the light in the room toward them. "A joke?" Li repeated, the word sounding like a death sentence. "You tried to reduce a queen to a clown for the amusement of men who are not fit to breathe the same air as her." Li stepped forward, his charcoal suit cutting a dark path through the air. He leaned in, his shadow swallowing Victor whole. "You told her that the floor was worth more than her life. I think it is time we see what your life is worth when the floor is taken from beneath you." Victor's gaze dropped to the oily mess on the floor, the very trap he had so carefully laid. He realized then that he was the one who was truly invisible. In the presence of a woman who had lost everything but never truly lost herself, he was nothing but the dirt he had ordered her to clean. His terror was no longer for his job or his reputation, it was the realization that in Li Taehuan's world, some debts are only settled in ruin. As Li began to lead Zafira toward the exit, his guards closing ranks behind them, Victor remained on the marble, a broken man in a gilded cage. He watched them go, his heart hammering against his ribs until he feared they might snap under the strain of being someone, anyone, else. The lost queen was walking back into the sun, and Victor Sloane was left alone in the cold, dark silence of the house he had built on lies. The silence in the grand lobby was no longer a vacuum, it was a courtroom, and the verdict had already been delivered. Li Taehuan stood with his hand still resting on Zafira's shoulder, a gesture that seemed to anchor her to a reality far removed from the soot and the stains of her uniform. He turned his gaze away from the broken man on the floor and toward the assembly of the city's elite, his eyes sweeping over them like a cold, winter wind. "You see a maid," Li began, his voice dropping into a resonant baritone that filled every corner of the vaulted ceiling. "You see someone you can walk past without a glance, someone whose only purpose is to absorb the debris of your lives. You looked at Zafira and saw a blemish on your perfection. But that is because you have forgotten how to see anything that isn't reflected in a mirror of gold." He stepped slightly forward, pulling Zafira into the full, unforgiving light of the center chandelier. "This is Zafira Elan Noir. A name that most of you once spoke with a reverence you now reserve only for your own bank accounts. She is the daughter of the man who built the schools your children attend and the woman who founded the very hospitals that keep you alive. She is a university graduate of the highest honors, a leader whose foundation changed thousands of lives before it was targeted by the same greed that rots this room tonight. A collective gasp, soft and sharp, moved through the investors. The name Elon Noir wasn't just a memory, it was a legend. They looked at the woman in the charcoal uniform, the woman they had just watched on her knees, and saw the high arc of the brow and the fierce, intelligent depth of the eyes they had once admired at galas far grander than this one. The soot on her face didn't look like dirt anymore, it looked like a mask she had finally decided to drop. She didn't fall into the gutters, Lee continued, his voice growing sharp with a lethal edge. She chose the shadows. When her world was set on fire by liars and thieves, she didn't come to you for charity. She chose to work. She chose to be invisible in your house so she could see the truth of who you are when you think no one is watching. She chose the rag and the soot to prove that a queen remains a queen, even when she is cleaning the floors of those who are not fit to walk behind her. Zafira felt the truth of his words settle in the room like a heavy, cold weight. She stood beside him, her head unbowed, her blue eyes meeting the gazes of the people who had mocked her. She saw the shame beginning to flicker in their eyes, the sudden, frantic need to rewrite the last hour of their lives. They realized then that her invisibility hadn't been a sign of her weakness, but a testament to their own blindness. She stayed here, Lee murmured, his gaze returning to her with a terrifyingly soft intensity, to see if any of you were worth the legacy her family left behind. And tonight, Victor Sloane gave her the answer. He looked back at the manager, who was still huddled on the marble, a shadow of the man who had walked in with a silver-headed cane. You thought you were setting a trap for a servant. You were actually mocking the very bloodline that allowed you to stand. You didn't just insult a maid, Victor. You insulted a noir. And in this city, that is a debt that even the Azure Heights cannot pay. The revelation was absolute. The lost queen had not been hiding because she was broken, she had been hiding because the world was too loud and too false. As Lee began to lead her away, the crowd didn't just part, they retreated. They bowed their heads, not out of respect, but out of a sudden, piercing fear of the woman who knew all their secrets and finally had the power to use them. The Azure Ghost was dead, and in the wake of the truth, Zafira Elon Noir stood as the only person in the room who truly knew the meaning of light. The silence that followed the revelation was not just a lack of sound, it was a physical weight, a heavy, airless curtain that had fallen on the theater of Victor Sloane's making. The social ambush he had meticulously orchestrated had not only failed, it had recoiled with the force of a tidal wave. Zafira stood in the center of the lobby, her hand resting beneath Lee Taehwan's firm, protective grip. The warmth of his hand was a singular point of reality in a room that had suddenly turned into a gallery of wax figures. She did not look at the dark, oily stain on the floor again. She did not need to. The blemish was no longer on the marble, it was on the reputations of everyone who had watched and laughed. We are finished here, Lee said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried through the stillness like a tolling bell. He began to walk, and Zafira moved with him, her stride matching his with a rhythmic, predatory grace. As they moved toward the towering oak doors, the crowd of investors and socialites, the same people who had pulled their silks away from her only moments ago, now moved with a frantic, desperate speed. They didn't just step aside, they retreated, creating a wide, hollow corridor through the center of the lobby. The sound of their breathing was the only music left, sharp and jagged with a fear they couldn't name. As she passed the mezzanine, Zafira's gaze drifted to the side. There, gathered in the service entrance, stood the people the world truly ignored. The catering staff in their white aprons, the other maids with their tired eyes, and the security guards who had been ordered to watch her fall. They stood in a stunned, reverent silence. Zafira saw the reflection of her own straight back in their eyes, and for a heartbeat, she paused. She didn't offer a speech, but she met the eyes of a young girl holding a silver tray, giving her a single, slow nod, a silent acknowledgement that the shadows were no longer a place of permanent exile. She turned her head one last time to look at Victor Sloane. He was still there, a crumpled figure on the white stone, his silver-headed cane lying uselessly beside him like the discarded toy of a broken child. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, their eyes locked. Zafira didn't offer him the satisfaction of her anger, she offered him only the terrifying weight of her presence. She was the woman he had tried to bury, and she was walking into a sun he would never see. The heavy doors swung open, and the night air rushed in, cold, clean, and smelling of ozone. It washed away the cloying scent of lilies and bourbon, the smell of a palace built on secrets. Outside, the world was a map of golden lights and deep, velvet shadows. A fleet of black SUVs sat idling at the curb, their engines a low, rhythmic growl that sounded like a dragon at rest. 3 suited guards stood like iron statues, their arms folded, their backs against the dark metal. They didn't move until Lee and Zafira approached, at which point they bowed in a single, synchronized motion, throwing the car door open with a precision that echoed the sound of power. Zafira stepped into the car, the leather cool and smelling of cedarwood against her skin. As the engine purred and the Azure Heights began to recede into the distance, she watched her reflection in the dark glass of the window. The soot was still there, a dark smudge against the porcelain curve of her jaw, but the eyes that looked back were no longer the eyes of a ghost. They were the eyes of a woman who had been knocked down but never truly lost. She saw a crown that no one had given her, and that no one, not Victor Sloane, not the city's elite, and not the shadows of her past, could ever take away. So, Lee murmured beside her, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. Was it enough? Zafira watched the golden lights of the city blur into a river of fire. She felt the heavy, obsidian coin in her pocket, a weight that no longer felt like a secret, but like a foundation. She took a deep breath, a breath that tasted of freedom and the cold, sharp promise of the morning. No, she said, her voice resonant and unafraid. It isn't enough. This is just the beginning. The car sped into the night, leaving the house of shadows behind. The lost queen was home, and the world was finally going to learn her name.